the National Guard, which usually is charged with clamping down on protests in Russia, is now going to be equipped with tanks and heavy weaponry. So Putin needs more forces within Russia to kind of essentially protect his government from something like this happening again. It's all been kind of a dizzying few days, really, with a lot of mixed messaging. First, they launched criminal proceedings against the leader of this mutiny, then they take that back. But I mean, Putin's narrative all along, ever since he came to power, really has been kind of the unity of the Russian nation and how it's the most unified country in the world, in his words. So, he tries to avoid anything that kind of smacks of any internal conflict. I think he wants to, at the moment, avoid as much conflict as possible as Russia kind of wages this war in Ukraine.
But Matt, it doesn't just smell of disruption, internal disruption, does it? It stinks of it. Is it not serious? Should we not take it as a sign that Russia may be imploding?
Well, we should also take into account that there's a very different perception within Russia than there is abroad. I mean, the events that we're seeing with kind of relatively accurate information that we can glean from what's happening in the video footage that we have access to is quite different to what Russians see on state TV, which very, very kind of actively censors the information. And Putin is overseeing this huge propaganda machine that he tries to ensure doesn't, and tries to ensure doesn't kind of allow such information to get to the majority of people. So his goal is to kind of maintain this facade, while behind the scenes, ensuring that there aren't really great cracks in the elite, because this definitely puts, as you say, we should not underestimate how much of a strain it puts on his system.
I mean, Prigozhin appears pretty unhinged in, quite a lot of his actions. Do we know what actually triggered the failed mutiny yet, and indeed why it failed?
Well, there's kind of his version. In fact, there's kind of two versions presented by him, which kind of contradict each other. One is that, there's been this kind of long-running feud between his Wagner group and the Russian Defense Ministry. He's accused them of blocking the supply of ammunition, shells to his troops who were spearheading the operation to seize Bakhmut, this city in Ukraine's east that really is the only significant victory for Russian forces since almost in a year. So that kind of this feud escalated, and then on Friday evening he published a very unclear video that he said showed evidence that the Russian Defense Ministry had shelled a camp of his forces. And then yesterday he released this long audio message outlining all the reasons for why he decided to stage what he calls this kind of march of justice on Moscow, which didn't mention that video at all. It mentioned nothing about any kind of missile attack on his troops. And we didn't see any evidence of that either. So he seems to be kind of sending out these contradictory messages, but really his line is that there's, his forces have been preventing his forces have been prevented from trying to kind of stage, spearhead the Russian campaign in Ukraine. And finally, the big trigger was a decision by the Russian state to fold Wagner, this paramilitary unit, into the defense ministry. So all Wagner fighters had to sign contracts with the defense ministry by July 1st.
And do we know if this action has put a stop to that? I mean, is that because that sounds to me actually like the most compelling reason that he might have been driven to do this?
Yeah, that seems to be the most compelling reason, because that essentially kind of marks an end of Wagner as a kind of capable, independent fighting force. We don't know exactly what the future of Wagner is. I mean, the official line is that they have somehow kind of been exiled to Belarus, which no one seems to believe is actually going to happen, and we've seen no evidence of kind of large numbers of these fighters appearing in Belarus. The official line is that all fighters, Putin said this today, all fighters of the Wagner group can sign these contracts at the defense ministry and keep fighting in Ukraine. But he didn't make clear what will happen to the rest.
I mean, the other question, of course, is why Belarus? I mean, why would Prigozhin choose Belarus? Because Lukashenko is a friend of Putin's rather than Prigozhin's, isn't he?
Yeah, but Prigozhin did not, in any of his statements, suggest that he's, trying to push
He's going there.
or trying to remove Putin. And there's still so much that's unclear about Belarus's role in this. Obviously, Lukashenko, this dictator of Belarus, who himself had a huge scare in 2020 where he was very close to being toppled by massive street protests. He obviously has an incentive to try and build up his political capital. And if he can kind of appear as the guy who saved Russia from civil war, it's definitely kind of going to help his political standing. So everyone kind of gains a little bit from this and everyone loses a lot as well.
And does it impact? I mean, obviously, I suppose for all of us supporting Ukraine, against the Russian invasion, does it make Russia slightly less forceful in terms of? I mean, I imagine that Putin will now have to call back some. I mean, if there is this instability, then there's perhaps some of the fighters who are currently fighting in Ukraine will have to go home to protect the president.
No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think he has to pull back troops from Ukraine. Today, there was a decision announced, it's still to be confirmed, that the National Guard, which usually is charged with clamping down on protests in Russia, is now going to be equipped with tanks and heavy weaponry. So Putin needs more forces within Russia to kind of essentially protect his government from something like this happening again. Whether it's going to affect the course of Russia's campaign in Ukraine, which has been faring very badly for months anyway, is kind of unclear. But obviously, if you're fighting an enemy, any major divisions politically at home for that enemy are going to work to your advantage. So Ukraine is kind of being a little bit coy about exactly how it will affect its this big counteroffensive that it's staging right now. But I'm sure it's not going to play into Russia's hands.
Just finally, you're also a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, as I said, that the same paper that Evan Gershkovich, the reporter who's been detained for spying in Moscow, works for. What's the atmosphere like for foreign reporters who cover Russia, or are there not many foreign reporters covering Russia any longer?
Well, we cover Russia. There's a lot of us,
Yeah,
but we cover Russia
but
from
not in
inside.
Russia. Yeah.
Yes, there are very few journalists Western journalists who are still in Russia today. Even before my colleague Evan's arrest on completely fabricated charges, it was very difficult for us to work there because the foreign ministry simply was not giving us accreditation. And now I think for safety reasons, mainly, a lot of reporters don't want to go back to the country. So there are very few left, and it's increasingly becoming a very difficult place to report from.
And is there any word at all on how Evan's faring?
We receive letters from Evan and we write to him, and I would encourage anyone who wants to write Evan a letter, and you can go to a website called Free Evan Gershkovich. There's kind of an email address that you can send letters to Evan to, and I'm sure he'll be happy to receive letters from your listeners. But he's doing okay. We saw him recently at an appeal hearing that was rejected by a Russian court, which extended his arrest. So he's faring okay considering the circumstances. But obviously, we want him to be released as soon as possible.